The requisition form called it a welfare assessment. The coalition called it a posting. I called it what it was: a ride out to a place where something was dying, and a signature to make the dying official. Had done 41 of them by the time they sent me to Kethavar South. 41. I want you to understand what that number means. It means 41 sites across 6 frontier zones, most of them in the first 3 years after the draconian withdrawal, when the coalition was still trying to figure out what to do with every creature the war had left stranded. Some sites were small. A single hatchling too far gone to relocate. A wounded subadult with a fused joint that would never bear weight again. Some sites were larger. A ravine in the Soul Cult Passage, where 11 mid-class warriors had sheltered in the final months of the war and could not be moved without equipment the coalition had already decommissioned, and where by the time I arrived, 3 of them had already resolved the question themselves. I assessed, I filed the forms, I moved to the next posting. I was not callous. I want that understood too. I had been an animal welfare assessor for 16 years by then, and a coalition emergency field medic for 11 before that, and I had learned, the hard way, the only way, that the most useful thing you can do for a dying creature is not to pretend it isn't dying. You give it what comfort is available. You make sure it isn't in unnecessary pain. And then you file the form, and the form closes the file, and the coalition's leases the resources it was holding in case of a miracle. And the miracle doesn't come, and everything continues. That is the work. It is honest work. I believed in it. I still believe in it if you want to know the truth. Nothing that happened at Kethavar South changed what I believe about the work. What it changed was something else. I am still finding the right word for it. I will get there. The posting came through on a Tuesday. My coordinator, a woman named Fenna Osk, who had been routing my assignments for 6 of my 16 years, and who communicated almost exclusively in the laconic shorthand of someone who had watched too many of her field assessors burn out, sent me 3 lines. Kethavar South. 1 subject. Ancient class. Designation. Last sighting form prior. Coalition welfare flagged for assessment after a border patrol noted thermal signature in the old shelter grid, quadrant 7. Duration estimate 1 to 2 days. Standard protocol. Standard protocol. I packed my standard kit. A day and a half of supplies because I'd learned early to pack for 2 days even on 1-day calls. My field assessment toolkit. The pressure sensors. Tissue scanners. The portable thermal unit. The forms both digital and paper, because the digital ones had a habit of failing in zones where old draconic shielding still contaminated the signal. A change of clothes. A thermos of coffee Fenna had once told me was unprofessional, and which I had continued packing anyway. Transport dropped me at the edge of the Kethavar South assessment zone at 7 in the morning. Local. Pilot. A young man who looked like he hadn't quite decided yet whether he was afraid of dragon zones or not, told me the pickup window was the following afternoon, standard retrieval. He was gone before I'd finished shouldering my kit. I stood for a moment and looked at the field. Kethavar had been a battle site. That was not unusual. Most of my postings were in or near sites where the war had touched, because that was where creatures ended up stranded or injured, and then forgotten. But Kethavar South was a particular kind of battle site. A crater field or a blast zones, but a slow attrition ground. The kind of terrain where 2 forces had ground against each other across months rather than hours. The mudflat plain was wide and low, maybe 4 kilometers across at its broadest, bounded on the north by a collapsed ridge, and on the south by a long line of what had once been a logistics corridor, and was now just pale slag and grown scrub. The morning light came in flat and gray off the eastern rise. Everything smelled of wet mineral and old char. There were structures at the western edge. The shelter grid the patrol report had mentioned. Not much. A series of heavy stone enclosures that predated the war by several centuries, built in the draconic Shalek style with walls 2 meters thick and roof spans, that had largely survived the battle because they were simply too massive. Fail. They had been used as field shelters in the war's final phase. Most were empty now. The patrol's thermal reading had put my subject in the last one, the largest, set back against the ridge. I walked across the mudflat. 20 minutes. The ground was firm in most places, and treacherous in a few. Pockets of soft mud that the morning chill had crusted over. just enough to look solid. I fell through twice to my ankles and once to my knee, swore, and kept going. The sky was cloudless, and the air had a thin, cold clarity to it that I'd come to associate with high-altitude frontier zones. The kind of air that makes distances deceptive and sounds carry strange. I heard her before I saw her. Not a cry, nothing dramatic. A sound like the slow movement of something very, very large in a small space. The deep, rhythmic resonance of breathing that is working harder than it should have to. Ancient class dragons breathe like tidal mechanisms when they're healthy. When they're not, you can hear the effort. I came around the last shelter wall and stopped. She was enormous. I had assessed ancient class subjects before, 3 of them. Across my 41 postings, I knew the scale. But knowing it and standing in front of it are 2 different things, and I stood there for a moment, doing nothing useful at all, while my eyes tried to reconcile the size of the creature in front of me with the size of the enclosure that was somehow containing her. She had folded herself. That was the only word. Into the shelter the way very large things sometimes adapt to spaces not built for them, with a kind of resigned compression that spoke of long practice. Her main body was iron black, the scales weathered to a dull, ridged surface that had lost the reflective quality healthy ancient scales carry. Crest. The great bony structure that runs from the crown to mid-spine on ancient class females of the Orth lineage was reduced on the left side to a bare ruin of what it had been, fused and discolored. Her 4 wings were tucked, but not cleanly. The upper pair was in reasonable shape. The lower left was fused at the second joint, and she could not have extended it without tearing something. 3 of her limb joints were visibly swollen. Her tail was still, genuinely still, not resting still, but the specific stillness of a creature that has learned not to move things that hurt. 1 eye was milky with cataract. The other was open, and it was amber, and it was looking directly at me, I said, in the standard coalition draconic greeting. The formal opening you use for ancient class subjects, because using the informal version is an insult. Some of them remember, and some of them don't, and I had never been willing to find out which. I see you, Elder. I am a coalition welfare assessor. I am here to assess your condition and determine what support is available. She did not respond. I set down my kit. I took out the tissue scanner and the pressure sensors. I kept my movements slow and my hands visible, because ancient class subjects in end-stage decline sometimes lash out, and an old reflex in a creature that size will kill you as easily as a deliberate attack. She watched me the way a very old animal watches something it has already decided is not worth the energy to respond to. Took my readings. I filed my preliminary notes. I stood up and looked at her, and she looked at me, and I said, in the formal draconic, though I don't know why I bothered. Since she had not acknowledged the greeting, "You are Veth Orth Karamessa, of the Orth founding line. My records show you were last assessed 4 months ago at Solon Station and declined transport. I am required to ask you again, is there and you wish to be transported to, or a person you wish to be contacted?" She said, in a voice like the slow movement of stone, "Sit down." I sat down. I don't know why I did it. The protocol does not include sitting down. The protocol includes the formal greeting, the assessment readings, the transport offer, the refusal documentation, and the signature on the end-of-life certification. It does not include sitting down in the mud next to an ancient class dragon because she told you to. I sat down anyway. I put my back against the shelter wall, and my kit was between my feet, and the morning light came in through the gap in the roof and lay across the yard in a long, pale strip, and Vethoreth Karamessa looked at me with her amber eye and did not say anything else for a while. After perhaps 10 minutes, she said, "You carry the smell of the work," I said. "What work?" she said. "The kind of work where you come to the end of things and make the end official." A pause, long enough that I thought she was done. Then, "I know that smell. I have had 43 of you come to me across the years," I said. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." 2 of them were correct. The end of things should be made official. It gives the dying dignity. Another pause. Then very quietly, "I sent them all away," I said. "I know. I have the records," she said. "Sit down," I said. "You stood up when I was talking." I had not stood up. I had shifted my weight. I sat back down. That was the first morning. I filed my preliminary assessment that afternoon. Ancient class subject, founding line designation, Confirmed present at Kethavar South, Quadrant 7 shelter. Condition terminal. Prognosis: weeks to months. Pending stress indicators. Coalition welfare transport declined. Consistent with previous assessments. No active intervention indicated. Monitoring recommended. I requested a 2-week extension on my posting. Citing the subject's instability and the regulatory requirement for a welfare check at the time of confirmed death. Fena sent back one line, extended. Standard protocol. I went back to the shelter the next morning, and every morning after that. I want to be careful here about how I describe what followed, because there is a version of this story that makes it sentimental in a way it was not, and there is a version that makes me sound like I was doing something noble, and both of those versions are wrong. What I was doing was the work. The work had extended, that was all. It had extended because the work requires that you be present at the end, and the end was taking longer than the initial assessment suggested it would, and so I was present. That is the honest account. I am going to give you the rest of it anyway, because the rest of it is also true. She talked. That was the thing I had not expected. Not all ancient class subjects in decline communicate much. Some of them are past language by the time they're assessed, and some of them have simply decided that the energy required for speech is no longer worthwhile. Veth Orath Kara Mesa was not one of those. She talked the way someone talks when they have been alone for a long time, and have decided, for reasons of their own, particular silence has gone on long enough. She did not talk about herself, not directly. She talked about things. She talked about the Orath founding line protocols, the naming rights, the boundary conventions, the old compact that the Orath matriarchs had held with the territories they claimed. She talked about the way the Kethavar plain had looked when the battle first reached it. What had been there before, how the ridge had been shaped differently, what the morning light had done to the particular mineral content of the local mud, when there was still enough undisturbed ground to reflect it properly. She talked about the old register of formal draconic, the deep, formal language that predated the coalition's standardized communication protocols by several centuries, and the fact most of the creatures who spoke it fluently were gone. I listened, filled in my forms. I checked her wound sites. There were 7 that needed monitoring, and I cleaned 3 of them daily because the climate was not doing it any favors. I sourced water from the patrol station 2 kilometers east and brought it in a repurposed fuel canister because the shelter had no water access. She was not moving, and dehydration is an unkind way to go when you've earned better. I rigged a partial shelter extension off the original roof gap with a sheet of thermal material I had in my kit because the morning light was hitting her milky eye at an angle that made her flinch, and she would not tell me to stop. I was not a vet in the formal sense by then. I had been in my coalition days. The Emergency Animal Corps had trained me in field medicine for large class creatures, which was how I'd come to welfare assessment in the first place. I still had the training. I still had the instincts. I used them. It was not treatment exactly. I had no illusions about treatment, but it was maintenance, and maintenance is a form of dignity. Dignity was the one thing I could still provide. She watched me work. She did not thank me. She talked. On the 6th day, she said, "You know the old greeting," I said. "The formal register?" "Yes." "Coalition training," she said. "You say it correctly." "Most of them say the vowels wrong," I said. "I had a good teacher. A Vorath line elder at the Solon assessment station 8 years ago. She was patient with me about the vowels." A pause, then Solon Vorath. "Old line, good line." And then, as though it followed logically, "Is your name," I told her. She said, "Orendast, a frontier name." "Old coalition." I said, "My grandmother's family." "From the Toval territories," she said. "The Toval territories." I knew those lands when they were called something else. And then she said the name, a long, formal draconic name that I did not know and could not write down fast enough, though I tried. And she described the land as it had been, the way a person describes a place they knew before you were born, with the specificity of actual memory. She talked for perhaps 40 minutes. I stopped filling in my forms and just listened. That was the 6th day. On the 9th day, a coalition compliance officer arrived. I heard the transport before I saw it. A light administrative shuttle, the kind the welfare office uses for site verification. Not the heavy class movers they send. when they actually intend to do something. It set down on the flat ground east of the shelter grid, and a young man got out with a data tablet and a look on his face that I recognized, the look of someone who had been given an assignment they considered beneath them and intended to get through it quickly. His name was Cale Dorn. He introduced himself as a welfare compliance liaison, which was a designation I had not heard before. He shook my hand with the particular efficiency of someone who considers handshakes a bureaucratic formality rather than a social one, and he told me he was there to conduct a site review under the Coalition Welfare Code, subsection 4, covered extended single-subject assessments in contested resource zones. I said. Contested resource, he said. The Kethavar South site is flagged in the Coalition Resource Inventory as a potential secondary extraction zone. There are subsurface mineral formations in Quadrant 7 that were identified in the survey 2 years ago, and that the Coalition has not formally released from contingency planning. He looked at his tablet. An extended welfare posting creates a formal occupancy claim that would complicate any future extraction operation, I said. She is not an occupancy claim. She is a dying ancient class welfare subject, he said. I understand that. I'm not disputing the welfare status. I'm noting that the extended posting creates regulatory complexity. He looked at the shelter. Is the subject, I said. She is in the shelter. She is not to be disturbed, he said. I need to conduct a visual confirmation of the subject's condition to verify the welfare necessity. I said, you can have my assessment readings. I file them every morning. They're in the welfare record, he said. I need a visual confirmation. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, come with me. I took him to the shelter entrance, the gap I had expanded, and I stopped him there and said, in the formal draconic greeting, in the correct vowels, Elder, I am bringing a Coalition compliance officer to the entrance. He requires a visual confirmation of your condition for the record. He will not enter the shelter. She did not respond immediately. Then she said, in the regular register, understood, I said to Cale Dorn. Look from here. He looked. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, in a voice that had lost some of its administrative briskness, how long has she been in this condition? I said. The decline started well before I arrived. She was in terminal decline when the patrol first flagged her 4 months ago. She has been in this shelter for approximately 18 months, he said. And the Coalition, I said, declined to authorize transport 9 times over the past 2 years. Each time she refused. The transport isn't the issue. The issue is that she is the last Orith Elder in this zone, and she chose this place and she has been here alone, and she will die here, and the Coalition Welfare Code requires that she be assessed, and that she be monitored, and that her death be properly recorded. I looked at him. That is what I am doing. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, the subsection 4 review, I said. File whatever you need to file. Note the welfare necessity. Note the subject's designation as an ancient class founding line elder. Note the formal Orith protocol requirements around end-of-life monitoring. And note that removing the welfare assessor from the site before the subject's natural death would be a breach of Coalition Welfare Code Section 7, subsection 2, which I assume you are also familiar with. He was. I could see it in the way his expression shifted. The slight recalibration of someone who had expected a routine site visit and had encountered, instead, a field assessor who had read the same code he had. He filed his review. It came back 3 days later. Welfare necessity confirmed. Extended posting authorized under Section 7, subsection 2, resource conflict deferred. Cale Dorn did not return. Told her about it that evening, she said. What did he want? I said. The ground under the shelter, there are minerals in it, she said. Yes. I know. A pause. They have been interested in the ground under this shelter for a long time, since before the war. Another pause. That is one of the reasons the protocols are in the wall, I said. You hid them in the wall because of the minerals, she said. I hid them in the wall because documents placed in the wall of a structure made of this stone, in a properly sealed case, survive things that documents kept elsewhere do not. And because the minerals make this ground valuable, and valuable ground attracts people who have no interest in what is written on 3 sheets of old composite material, but who might sell it, lose it, or use it for something that has nothing to do with what it is, I said. They're safe with me, she said. Yes. That is why I told you where they were. A pause. Read. On the 12th day, she asked me to read her the old protocols. I told her I didn't have them. That the formal ORATH protocols weren't in my standard kit. That I'd have to request them through coalition records. She told me where to find them. Not in coalition records. In the shelter itself. In the space between the third and fourth course of stone on the north wall, where a flat sealed case had been set into the construction at some point that predated the war by at least 2 centuries. I found it. Flat case of something that was not quite metal and not quite ceramic. A draconic composite material I recognized from welfare training but had never handled in the field. Inside it, wrapped in a material that had survived the intervening years better than almost anything else at Kethavar, south, were 3 sheets of something thin and strong, covered in the formal Orith script. I cannot read formal Orith script. I told her this. She said, "Give them to me." I held them up so she could see. She read them herself slowly, from memory as much as from the text. I understood that the reading was partly for my benefit, partly a ritual, partly something else I didn't have a word for. The old register sounded different when she used it at full register. Not louder, but deeper, more resonant, as though the stone walls were participating. I sat with my back against the north wall and listened and did not move for a long time. On the 15th day I called Fenna and asked for a second extension. She asked me how long. I said I wasn't sure. She said, "Oren," I said, "I know." She said, "Standard protocol does not cover indefinite monitoring." I said, "I know," she said. 2 weeks. I said, "All right." 2 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. I stopped counting and started tracking in days. The patrol station 2 kilometers east became, after the first 2 weeks, a supply point I used with enough regularity that the coalition staff there, a rotating crew of 4, with whom I had the pleasantly impersonal relationship of people who work near each other without working together, began to set aside the water, containers I needed before I arrived. They did not ask many questions about the posting. Frontier zones develop a practical courtesy about these things. You are working. They are working. The details of each other's work are not their business. One of them, a woman named Sessa, who handled the logistics manifest and who had a very good thermos she kept on a shelf by the door, told me around the 5th week that she'd mentioned the posting to her mother, who had grown up in the Toval territories, and that her mother had said, "The last Orith elder. Good. Someone should be there." I thought about that for several days. I thought about it while I was carrying water across the mud flat. I thought about it while I was cleaning the wound sites. Someone should be there. It was a simple thing to say. It was not a simple thing to mean. I also learned things about the shelter in those weeks. The slow accumulation of knowledge that comes from spending enough time in a particular space. The west gap, through which the evening light came, was aligned. I measured it carefully one afternoon, because I had the time and the interest, to within 2 degrees of the exact bearing that would catch the low autumn sun at the hour before dusk. The east gap was similarly aligned for the morning. The alignment was not accidental. The Orith founding line shelters. I found in the Coalition archive documents I had downloaded in the 3rd week to supplement my reading were always built with this orientation. Every morning and every evening, in a building correctly oriented, the light would enter. She had known this when she chose the shelter. She had chosen it deliberately. I did not tell her I had measured it. She probably knew. She probably knew most of what I did in the shelter and the enclosures adjacent to it, and she did not comment on any of it except for specific corrections. The wound wrap tension, the placement of the thermal sheet, particular angle of the water canister that made it easier for her to reach. And I made the corrections and continued. I want to tell you about the evenings because the evenings were different from the mornings. In the mornings I worked. I did the cleaning and the water and the maintenance and the forms. And she talked about things, and I listened. That was the rhythm of it. In the evenings, the light came down from the western gap in the roof, and it came in warm and low and amber, and it caught her scales, where the iron black had worn to something closer to deep brown at the edges, and it made the gold veining in her fused crest visible in a way it wasn't during the flat morning light. And she was quiet those evenings. Asleep. Just quiet. I was quiet too. I had brought 2 books with me in my kit. I always brought books. It was one of the things Fenna considered unprofessional, and I considered essential, and I read them in the evenings in the amber light. She watched me. I became aware after the first few evenings that she was not watching me the way she watched everything else in the shelter, with the distant cataloging attention of a creature monitoring its environment. She was watching me the way you watch something that you find not surprising exactly, interesting, worth attending to. On the 41st day, she said, "Read to me." I said, "From the books." She said, yes. I read to her. They were not remarkable books. One was a general history of the Toval territories that I'd been meaning to finish for 2 years. Was a novel that I'd found in the transport depot at Solon Station and picked up because it had a good cover and turned out to have a mediocre plot but excellent sentences. I read from the natural history first because it seemed more appropriate. And she listened with her amber eye half closed, and after a while, I switched to the novel because the natural history had gotten to the chapter on soil composition and even I was losing the thread, she said when I stopped. The one with the sentences, continue, I continued. We did that most evenings after that, I read. She listened. The amber light moved across the shelter floor and climbed the opposite wall and disappeared, and the cool dark came in, and I lit my small field lamp and kept reading until she told me to stop or until she went to sleep. She did with the slow deliberateness of very large creatures. A gradual settling of the breathing, a lowering of the great iron-black head. Slept in the shelter by then, not inside. I had a field bivouac set up in the enclosure immediately adjacent, because sleeping inside the shelter itself, with an ancient class subject, is something my training explicitly discouraged, and my instincts agreed with. Adjacent, close enough. On the 63rd day she told me about the war. She did not tell me about it the way the coalition histories told it. Not as a sequence of tactical events, not as a series of engagements and withdrawals and territorial losses. She told me about it the way someone tells you about something that happened to their body. The specific places where the damage had been done, the things that had been cut away or broken and had not healed, things that had broken and healed wrong, and what it felt like to carry them. She told me about the other Orath elders, the 4 who had died before the end of the war, the 2 who had survived but not survived intact, the one who had gone somewhere she did not know and had not been found. She told me about the last months of the Orath holding, when the shelter grid at Kethavar South had been a coordination point, and what the plain had looked like when everything was still happening on it, and what it looked like now. She talked for a long time that day. The morning passed, and the afternoon came in, and the amber light was already climbing the shelter walls before she was finished, and I had not moved much, and I had not filed my afternoon notes, and I did not particularly care. There are days in this work that you know while they are happening that you will not forget them. Not because anything dramatic occurred, because you were present for something that deserved being present for. That was one of those days. At the end of it, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I have not spoken of those months to anyone in a long time," I said. "I'm glad you did," she said after another pause. "You did not ask questions," I said. "No," she said, "most people ask questions. They are not bad questions. They are interested questions. But they pull the telling in the direction of what they want to understand, rather than the direction it needs to go." A pause. "You listened," I said. "Yes." She said nothing for a while. Then, "Correct," she said. "It is better now," I said. "The plain?" She said. "The quiet. Battlefields do not become peaceful quickly. Kethavar South has become peaceful. Slowly, but it has," I said. "Does it help? The quiet?" she said after a long pause. It helped that someone came and sat down, and then, before I could respond, "The wound on the 4th joint. You rewrapped it yesterday. You used a different tension. It is better," I said. I noticed the previous wrap was causing pressure when she extended the lower left by even a few degrees. I adjusted. She said, "She." You said she. Force of habit. From welfare training. We use the formal third person when discussing subjects in. I stopped. I said, "I'm sorry." "That was," she said. "Don't apologize. The formal third person is appropriate. I am a subject. You are an assessor. This is correct." A pause. Then, "You said she." "Not it. The training form uses it," I said. "Yes. I've never been able to make myself do that." She said nothing for a while then. I read. On the 78th day, I called Fenna. She picked up before the second tone, which meant she had been expecting the call. I said, I need another extension, she said. Oren. I said, I know, she said. You have been out there for 11 weeks, I said. 11 weeks and 3 days, she said. The coalition will not keep the posting open indefinitely. The resources, I said. I know. I'm not asking for resources. I'm asking for an open-ended extension with minimal support. I can work on secondary assessments in the region. There are 3 other subjects in the Kethavar zone that haven't been formally closed. I can cover them and file reports. Posting costs almost nothing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Is she still in? I said. She has maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe less, she said. Oren, why? I thought about it. I said, because she's the last one. And she's been alone here for a year and a half. And she asked me to sit down. Fenna was quiet again. Then she said, Extension granted. Secondary assessments authorized. File whatever you can. And then, you sound different, I said. I'm fine. She said, that's not what I mean. And she closed the line. I thought about what she meant, walking back across the mudflat to the shelter. The weather had changed in the past week. Less chill, more wind. The scrub at the southern edge of the plain beginning to show something that might become green in another month. The sky was very large out there. I had always known abstractly that frontier zones had large skies. 80 days of walking across the same mudflat to the same shelter had made me aware of it in a different way. The specific quality of the feast, light at different times of day, the way the color changed in the hour before dark, the sounds the wind made across the collapsed ridge. She was awake when I got back. She watched me come in through the gap in the shelter wall. I had expanded the gap in the 6th week because the original entrance was not quite large enough for me to move quickly if I needed to, and she had watched me work on it for 2 days without comment. And when I was done, she had said, correct, which I had understood after a moment to mean that she approved of the modification. I sat down. I got out the tissue scanner and ran the daily check. The readings were not good. They had not been good for several weeks, but they were less good than yesterday's. And the pattern was the one you learn to read in welfare training, the one that means the body is beginning the final series of closures. I filed my notes, she said. What did your coordinator say? I said. Extension granted, she said. She asked why you stayed. I said, yes. She said, what did you tell her? I said, that you asked me to sit down. She was quiet for a while. Then that is a true answer, I said. It's the only one I had, she said. Read. I had finished both books by then. Also finished, in the preceding weeks, a coalition field manual I found in the patrol station, a pamphlet about soil reclamation techniques that had been left in the adjacent enclosure by someone at some point, and a very long technical document about the structural properties of the draconic composite material that her sealed case was made of, which I had downloaded from the Coalition archive because there was nothing else to read, and which turned out to be genuinely interesting. I had told her about all of them. She had a particular opinion about the soil reclamation pamphlet, dismissive, and a specific, informed question about the composite material document. She knew what it was made of. I did not. She told me. Still, do not entirely understand the answer. But it was detailed, and it was delivered with the certainty of someone who had been present when the material was developed. What I read to her that evening was the natural history of the Toval territories, which I had restarted from the beginning, because there was something appropriate about it. She had described those territories as they had been, before the coalitions, before the war. The natural history described them as they were now. It was not a comfortable comparison, but she asked for it and I read it, and at a certain point she stopped me and said, the East Ridge. The book says the East Ridge was altered in the 3rd year of the expansion, I said. Yes, rerouted a water system, she said. I know the ridge it means. The water it carried fed a particular kind of clay formation on the south, facing slope. The clay showed specific color in the late afternoon light. A pause then. It had a name, the formation. She told me the name. In the old register, I said. Do you want me to write it down? She said. No, it is in the protocols, the 3rd sheet, the names of the landforms. I looked. It was there in the formal Orth script I could not read. 3rd sheet, 2nd column. I said, I can't read this. I can make sure someone who can get these documents after, she said. After, I said. I'll make sure of it. She looked at me with her amber eye for a long time. Then, I know you will. On the 83rd day, she stopped eating. This was not a surprise. I had been expecting it, and the tissue scanner had been showing the precursor indicators for 2 weeks. I maintained the water. I maintained the wound sites. I sat with her in the evenings and read, and in the mornings I did the checks and filed the forms, and I walked to the patrol station for water, and walked back, and the sky was very large, and the wind was warm now, genuinely warm. The scrub at the southern edge was definitively green. The reading continued, those last days. I had long since finished both books, and had moved through everything else I had in my kit, and I had sent away to the Coalition archive for 3 more. They arrived via the supply drop Fenna had arranged. Practical, efficient, the way she did everything, and one of them turned out to be a history of the old Orith territorial boundaries that I had requested almost as an afterthought, and which turned out to be less a history than a record of place names, compiled by a Coalition linguist who had spent 40 years talking to elders and writing down what they said about the land. I read her those place names. She corrected them. Not all of them. Many of them the linguist had gotten right. For those, she was silent in a particular way. That means yes. But enough of them that I spent 2 evenings writing the corrections into the margins in my own hand, in the transliterated formal Draconic she had taught me. It was not a beautiful manuscript, but it was more accurate than it had been, and when I was done, she said, "Better." And I closed it and put it in my kit with the sealed case, and told her I would make sure that one was accounted for too. She said, "I know." On the 87th day she said to me, "Oren Dast." I said, "Yes," she said. "I am going to give you something," I said. "You don't have to," she said. "I am not asking. I am telling you what I am going to do." A pause. Then in the old register, full formal deep register, the one that resonated in the stone walls. "This is a naming. Listen correctly." I put down the scanner. I sat up straight. "I don't know why I sat up straight. It seemed like the right thing to do," she said. In the old register, a sentence that I recorded as best I could in my field notes, and that I have since had translated by 3 separate scholars, each of whom gave me a slightly different rendering, and the best composite I have been able to construct is this. Keth Orith, the one who tends the fire when the fire is going out, so the fire knows it mattered. The one who stays when the staying serves no purpose that can be named on a form. The one who carries water across a mudflat that is not their territory for a creature that owes them nothing, reasons that have no entry in the official record. She said it in the old register. The stone walls resonated. The amber eye was steady, I said. "I don't know what that means. For me, formally," she said, "it means what it means. It is a name. Names mean what they mean." A pause, then, in the regular register, quieter. "You are the 44th assessor who came to me. You are the first one who sat down because I asked," I said. "First," she said. The others were polite. They sat at the correct assessment distance. They completed the correct forms. They offered transport. Refused, they documented the refusal. This is correct behavior. A pause. "You sat in the mud. You fixed the roof gap. You brought water in a fuel canister because you had nothing else. You read to me about soil composition. And I told you what I thought of it, and you agreed with me even though you did not have to." Something in her voice that I had not heard before. Quality of warmth that was not different in kind from anything she had said before, but different in weight. "You said she," I said. "Yes," she said. "That is enough. That is the whole of it. That is the reason for the name." On the 89th day, the readings were the final readings. Filed my assessment. Terminal. Ancient class subject, Orith founding line designation, Kethavar South, Quadrant 7. Natural decline. Welfare monitoring current, no active intervention indicated or available. Welfare assessor, on site, subject-oriented, communicative. Expected conclusion, imminent days. I sent it to Fenna. She sent back one line, understood, standing by. On the 90th day, she slept most of the day, and I sat outside in the morning sun and read the natural history of the Toval territories and thought about soil composition and clay formations and the names of things that no longer had witnesses. In the afternoon, I went back in and sat with her, and she was awake, and she looked at me with the amber eye, and I said, "I have the protocols. I'll make sure of them, she said. I know. I said, is there anything else? She was quiet for a long time. Then, the light, in the evenings. When it comes through the west gap, I said. Yes, she said. It is a good light, I said. Yes, it is, she said. Read. I read until dark. She went to sleep before I finished the chapter. I put the lamp on low and kept reading for a while. Because the shelter was quiet, and the light was good, and I was not ready to go next door to the bivouac. On the 91st day, at dawn, she died. I was there. I had woken early, I don't know why. There was no sound, just the particular quality of the air that you develop a sense for, in this work, when the thing that was going to happen is happening. I went in through the gap in the shelter wall, and she was already in the last of, breathing very slow and very far apart, and I sat down next to her and put my hand on the iron-black scales of her foreleg. They were warm, faintly warm, the deep retained warmth of a large creature's body, and I stayed there, and the dawn light came in through the east gap, and lay across the shelter floor in a long pale strip, and she breathed twice more, and then she did not breathe again. I sat there for a while, I don't know how long. Then I took out the field assessment kit, and I ran the confirmation readings, and I filed the form. Ancient class subject, founding line designation, confirmed deceased, Kethavar South, quadrant 791st day of extended monitoring, time of death, dawn. Welfare assessor on site, full unassisted decline. Natural causes. I took the sealed case with the 3 protocol sheets. I wrapped it in the thermal material from my kit. I packed my kit. I called Fenna. She picked up immediately. I said, "It's done," she said. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'll send the transport," I said, "tomorrow." I have 3 sector assessments in the southern zone I told you I'd cover. I'll do them today, and you can pick me up tomorrow morning. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Oren, you don't have to," I said. "I know, I want to," she said. "All right, tomorrow morning." I spent that day covering the secondary assessments. 2 in the southern zone, 1 at the eastern edge of the mudflat. All 3 were straightforward, the kind of case that takes an hour. Observe, take readings, file form, close the record. I did it carefully. Do it carefully. The work requires care. I got back to the shelter at late afternoon to collect the rest of my kit from the bivouac. The amber light was coming through the west gap, the long, warm evening light. And it fell across the shelter floor where I had sat and read, and I stood at the gap in the wall and looked at it for a while. It was a good light. She had been right about that. I went to pick up my bivouac kit, and when I came back around the shelter wall, I saw the ships, 7 of them. Heavy class, Orith designation. I recognized the hull configuration from welfare training. The deep iron black with gold-veined accents that mirrored the coloring of the ancient class lineage. They were sitting down on the western edge of the mudflat, and the ground shook in a way that was not unpleasant and not small, and they were quiet, the Orith ships. Quieter than coalition vessels of class, a deep, contained quality of power, like something very large deciding to be still. I stood with my kit on my back and watched them land. The delegation that came across the mudflat was not small. I counted 11 figures before I stopped counting. Ancient class and mid-class. 4 of them in the colors I had come to associate, from the protocol sheets, with the Orith continuance wing. Deep iron black with the gold-veined trim on their crests and foreleg markings. The formal heraldic designations that I could, now after 91 days, read just well enough to know what I was looking at. The one in the lead was old. Not dying, nothing like what I had left in the shelter, but old in the way that carries authority rather than weight, the kind of old that has survived enough to know what surviving costs. Iron black, gold-veined, crest intact and formal, moving with the deliberate economy of something that had learned long ago that it did not need to move fast to arrive where it needed to be. She stopped in front of me. The others stopped behind her, and the mudflat was very quiet, and the amber light caught the gold veining in her crest. She said in the old register, the full formal deep register, the one that resonated in stone walls, and I understood it, all of it, because 91 days of listening is a kind of teaching. We are Veth Orith continuance. We received the naming signal 14 hours ago. We came, said. She died at dawn, she said. We know. The naming signal carries the moment. A pause. We were not looking for her. We had looked for a long time. We had accepted that we would not find her. Something in her voice, careful and precise, That was not quite grief and not quite relief, and was both. We were not expecting to receive a naming from her. We had not expected her voice again, I said. She held the protocols. They're here. I held out the wrapped case. I promised I'd make sure they got to someone who could read them. And there's a corrected edition of the Orith Territorial Boundary History. A Coalition Archive volume with her corrections in the margins, transliterated. I'd like that to go somewhere it will be kept. She looked at the case. She looked at me. She looked at the corrected history I was holding in my other hand, and something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that I could have pointed to and named, but it changed. She said, "You stayed with her." I said, "Yes." She said, "For how long?" I said, 21 days. The mudflat was very quiet. One of the ships behind her made a small sound, a resonant, deep sound, a harmonic I did not know the word for, and the others behind her made it too, softly, and it moved through the air the way the old register moved through stone walls, and I felt it in my chest. She said, "She named you." I said, "Yes. I'm not sure what that means. For the record, I understand it was a formal naming, but I don't know the formal implications." She said, "It means what it means. Kethorath, the old register." Again, the name, she said, carried the same resonance it had when Veth Orath Karamessa had spoken it in the shelter, the same quality of stone walls and deep weight. The ones who stays when the staying serves no purpose that can be named on a form. She looked at me steadily. "We have not given that name in 4 generations. In the history of the Orith founding line, it has been given 11 times. You are the 12th. I said, "I was doing my job." She said, "Yes, and more than your job, and less than a hero." Exactly what she needed. A pause. "This is why the name exists. For the person who does the thing that has no name and needs one," I said. "Has secondary assessment forms to file." She looked at me, the amber eye. Not her amber eye, but the same amber. The Orith amber was steady and serious, and something else I did not have a word for. Then she said, "Yes, file them." I said, "And then, what does it mean, the naming, formally?" "For me," she said, "it means the Orith continuance holds a claim on you. A formal claim. A named claim. It does not obligate you. It is not a command. It is a recognition." A pause. "It means that when you need something that the Orith can give. Passage, aid, a voice in a place where your voice alone would not carry. You say the name, and we come," I said. "Like you came today," she said. "We came today because she called. We will come when you call, because you were the one she called for." She looked at the sealed case in my hand. "Give me the protocols, and then file your forms." I gave her the protocols. She took them with both hands, in the formal Orath receiving gesture. I knew it from the protocol sheets, and I had not expected to see it. And I stood there, for a moment, watching her hold them and watching the 11 others behind her go very still. Then I shouldered my kit, and I walked back across the mudflat. The 3 secondary assessments took me until late evening. The forms were straightforward. I filed them, transmitted them to Fenna, noted the site closures, added the appropriate references to the welfare record. Standard protocol. The work requires that you do it completely, even at the end of a long day, even when the amber light is fading, and the ships on the western edge of the mudflat are lit from within, with a deep gold warmth that has nothing to do with the sunset. I called Fenna when I was done, she said. "All received. Good work." A pause. "Transport is confirmed for 0700. I said, "I'll be at the pickup point," she said. "Oren." A longer pause. "The Coalition Welfare Office received a communication this afternoon. The Veth Orith Continuance Delegation. Formal communication filed with the Welfare Office record." Another pause. "It cited your extended posting. It cited the naming. She stopped then. "It was very formal, very official. It said that your work at Kethavar South was conducted with the full protocol of the Keth Orith designation, and that the Veth Orith continuance formally acknowledges the Welfare Office's role in authorizing your extended posting, and that any future welfare operations in Orith-adjacent territories may call upon Veth Orith continuance support, formally and by name, the Kethorath designation as the operative credential." I said, "I didn't ask them to do that," she said. "I know you didn't." I said, "Is the Welfare Office? Are they going to want to talk to me about it?" she said. "Probably, eventually." A pause. "Oren, you should get some sleep." I said. "Yes," she said. "The transport is at 0700, don't miss it." I said, "I won't." I slept that night in the bivouac, in the enclosure adjacent to the shelter, as I had for most of 91 days. The sky was very clear and very large and very bright, with the kind of stars you only get in frontier zones. The kind of stars that remind you the sky has more in it than any single piece of it suggests. At 0700 I was at the pickup point with my kit, and the transport came down on schedule, and the same young pilot, older now. Or maybe I was just seeing him more clearly, looked at the ships on the western edge of the mudflat, and then looked at me and didn't say anything. Shh was the right thing. I took one last look at the shelter grid before we lifted. The amber morning light was coming in flat and gray from the east, the same light as the day I'd arrived. The 7 Orith ships were still there, settled and quiet on the western edge, and there was a stillness to the mudflat that was different from the stillness I had found when I arrived. Empty, exactly, but resolved. The way a long sentence looks after you've found the right last word. We lifted, the mudflat fell away. Plain became a mudflat, became a texture, became a color. And then we were above the ridge and it was gone. I had 3 new postings in my queue when I got back to the station. Fenna had sent them through the night before. Standard protocol. Read them on the transport. 2 in the Solon zone, 1 in the outlying Toval territories. Reasonable postings. Honest work. I would start on the Solon's ones first. There was a subadult there who had been flagged for 4 months and who needed to be assessed before the weather changed. I put the posting files away. I drank the last of the coffee from my thermos, cold, unremarkable, good anyway. I looked out the transport window at the frontier sky, which was very large and very clear and going on in all directions the way frontier skies do. Kethoreth, she had called me. The one who stays when the staying serves no purpose that can be named on a form. I thought, I would have stayed anyway. And then I thought, yes, that's the whole point of the name. The transport banked east toward Solon, toward the work. I picked up the first posting file and started reading.